Hey, you guys know about the Me-163 Komet? You know, the German rocket fighter that couldn't fly for very long and didn't do very well? You know the Japanese copied that? Or at least tried to? Yes, really! Hello, welcome to another episode of History in the Dark. I am your host, Darkness the Curse. And before we begin, as always, thank you so much to my generous patrons, my British rail critics, and of course my underwater train finders. You are the reason why this content remains highly volatile. And today, we are going to discuss the Mitsubishi J8M. Or, well, that's the Navy version. There was also the Ki-200. But both of these were basically the Japanese version of the Messerschmitt Me-163 Komet, developed by Germany during World War II. Japan wanted a piece of this awesome technology, and they did attempt to copy it, and it did work in the sense of copying the Komet, but how worth it was it to do that? This is the story of the Mitsubishi J8M Shūsui, which I'm probably pronouncing horribly. It's wrong. I don't know how to say that properly. Shūsui? It literally translates to autumn water. Yes, autumn water! Used poetically to mean sharp sword, deriving from the swishing sound of a sword. Japan! Now, as I imagine most people are generally aware, during World War II, Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan were actually allies, and were working together to defeat the Allied forces. They made up part of the Axis powers. So naturally, they did make certain efforts to get along and share certain pieces of technology. And Japan was looking for a way to keep America, hi, that's us, from bombing the heck out of them. As the war dragged on, Germany was just getting stomped into the ground when it came to strategic bombing runs. As the Allied forces creeped across the Pacific, it became more and more likely that Japan themselves was going to get regularly bombed, which did indeed end up happening, especially with the introduction of the B-29 Superfortress. Japan was looking for an effective way to combat this before it actually started happening, and they were well aware of the Messerschmitt Me-163 Komet, which was a rocket-powered interceptor aircraft. We have discussed these before, and they didn't work very well, for many reasons. They were flawed in several aspects. They had basically no range because they could only fly for about 7 minutes or so, and that's really terrible. Also, they used a particular kind of fuel to actually make it a rocket, and it involved two different chemical mixtures: t-stoff, which was the oxidizer, and c-stoff, which was the fuel itself. T-stoff was basically pure hydrogen peroxide, between 80 and 85%. The remainder was water and some trace amounts of stabilizers. C-stoff was a different mixture: 57% methanol, 30% hydrazine hydrate, 13% water, as well as catalyst 431, which was potassium tetracyanosuprate. When T-stoff and C-stoff are combined, they create a hypergolic propellant, which is used in rocket engines, and basically what happens is when they touch, they ignite. But even on their own, both substances were exceedingly dangerous, and there are some more exaggerated stories of this particular mixture, quote-unquote, dissolving pilots, which is not strictly true. It would, however, cause them to burn horribly in an unstoppable chemical fire, which, how do you define dissolve, I guess, is really where we're going with this. The point is, it was really dangerous stuff, and yes, many test pilots died as a result of fuel leaks. In fact, even when the Komets were used, it was found that they were alarmingly fragile, because any kind of puncture into the fuel would cause them to explode immediately because of how ridiculously volatile it was. So naturally, Imperial Japan just loved it. I mean, obviously, it was phenomenal. Yes, absolutely, 100%. We need more of this exact thing. And they did reach an agreement with Germany regarding licensing the Comet's design, and Germany was supposed to provide the following by spring 1944. The complete blueprints of the Me-163 Komet, as well as the HWK-509A engine that was used in these aircraft. One complete, fully assembled Komet, and 2 sets of sub-assemblies and components. 3 complete engines. They were also to inform Japan of any improvements and developments on the aircraft, and allow the Japanese to study both the manufacturing processes for the Komet and their components, as well as Luftwaffe operational procedures for the Komet. And Germany did make a fair attempt to honor this arrangement. Broken down aircraft and an engine were sent to Kobe, Japan in early 1944, and it's suspected they were on board the Japanese submarine, RO-501, which was actually formerly Germany's submarine, U-1224. The sub had left Germany on the 30th of March 1944, but she was sunk in the mid-Atlantic on the 13th of May 1944 by the Hunter-Killer Group based on the escort carrier USS Bogue. Then they tried to send plans and engines on board the Japanese submarine I-29, which left France on the 16th of April 1944, and managed to arrive in Singapore on the 14th of July, but then it was later sunk en route to Japan by the US submarine USS Sawfish on the 26th of July 1944 near the Philippines. Germany gave this one last try in February of 1945, sending another Komet on U-864. But then she was also sunk near Bergen by the British submarine, HMS Venturer. So really what I'm saying is that Japan was trying to get their hands on a Komet to copy, and Germany was trying to honor the agreement, because Japan had indeed paid them quite a bit to do this, roughly 20 million Reichmarks, which is over 81 million euros in today's money. But due to the situation that was going on in the war, none of the subs they sent could actually get the pieces that Japan desperately needed to actually put these things together. The one thing they did have was the basic instructional manual, which one Commander Aichi Iwaya had on his person, as he'd been on the I-29, but he chose to fly to Japan from Singapore, and therefore was not on the sub when she was sunk. So the plan turned into, instead of just straight copying the Komet, they were going to recreate the Komet from the ground up, and that was going to be a tall order since they had pretty much no components. They had to create everything from scratch based off of the instructional manual. Not really the best situation, but they gave it an honest try. It was actually supposed to be a joint project between the Japanese Army Air Service and the Navy Air Service, but the two branches of the military couldn't agree on what to do. The Army Air Service wanted an entirely new design to be drawn up, but the Navy Air Service thought that was really dumb and felt they should try to mimic the German Komet as close as possible because it had already been proven to be a stable aerodynamic body, and that was a very fair point. The one benefit of the Komet, despite all of its flaws, it wasn't a success. I can't stress that enough. But the one thing it did have going for it was its airframe. The Komet is very sleek, very modern looking, compared to the vast majority of World War II aircraft, especially ones that actually entered service. It has more in common, visually anyway, with modern jets than it does most World War II aircraft, at least from a superficial overall shape point of view. It's much more aerodynamic, and it was stable in the air, so naturally the Navy did win out, and the contract went to Mitsubishi. The Army Air Service still wasn't deterred though, and secretly decided to try to modify their own design to get one up on the Navy Air Service, so they basically had two different versions of this thing being worked on at about the same time, hence why the Navy had the J8M, and the Army wound up with the Ki-200. Engineering this aircraft from a manual was definitely a difficult thing to do, as one of the first things was to figure out how the heck they were even going to make the engine in the first place. They had to adapt what little plans they had for the 509A engine to Japanese manufacturing capabilities as well as techniques. They also wanted to produce a glider version of their Komet, which wound up being the MXY-8 Akigusa, or Autumn Grass. This thing was unpowered, and it was meant to train pilots to understand the flight characteristics, since, again, these could not fly very long. In fact, the final design had less fuel than the original Komets did, so their total flight time was even shorter. The whole point of these things was point defense, because they could accelerate and get very high very quickly, which, great, but 7 minutes in the air really is no time at all. In fact, at this point, consider this. You have probably been watching this YouTube video for a longer amount of time than the Komets could actually fly under power. I just want you to think about that. On the 8th of December 1944, the MXY-8, the glider version, was first tested by Lieutenant Commander Toyohiko Inuzuka. He found the design to absolutely be perfect. It emulated the handling characteristics of the Komet to a T. The Japanese had done a very good job of rebuilding the Komet, at least in terms of overall handling characteristics. They were able to adapt the engine for Japanese production and designated it the RO.2. And the prototypes outwardly looked somewhat similar to the Komet, but were obviously not quite the same thing. The Army version, the Ki-200, and the Navy version, J8M wound up differing in only the most minor of ways. And the most obvious difference was in the armament. The Army version was armed with two 30mm Type 5 cannons, while the Navy version was armed with two 30mm Ho-105 cannons. The Ho-105 was a little bit lighter than the Type 5. However, the RO.2 rocket motor turned out to not offer the same amount of thrust as the original German design, but it was still substantial, so it was considered good enough. But, again, it was using the same fuel, t-stoff combined with c-stoff, which again is very, very volatile. Also, Japan didn't call them that. They called them Ko and Otsu, respectively. But still the same stuff. It was still capable of murdering just so many of their pilots, but then again, this was Imperial Japan, and I just think at this point, perhaps the lives of their pilots may not have been the top of their priorities. I'm just saying, I think that may have been something to consider. The first powered flight took place on the 7th of July, 1945, with again Lieutenant Commander Toyohiko Inuzuka at the controls. It didn't go very well, as he climbed, the engine actually stopped abruptly and the J8M stalled. Inuzuka was a very good pilot, and he did manage to glide the aircraft back to the ground, but the problem was he slightly clipped a small building at the edge of the airfield. And if it was any other plane, that probably wouldn't have caused a problem. But this was a copy of the Komet, which had t-stoff and c-stoff on board. It exploded, and Inuzuka died the next day. The cause of the accident was actually due to the design of the engine. For the test, the plane had not been loaded with a full complement of fuel, only half, and that resulted in the fuel shifting in the tanks, which caused an auto cutout device to activate because of an airlock in the fuel line. The remaining prototypes were grounded until this problem was solved. They were working on it and did eventually manage to fix it, though in the meantime another explosion of the fuel mixture happened on the ground, just a few days after the initial crash, so great. And they were ready to go, but then the war ended. There was no reason to even use them at that point. Japan had surrendered, the Allies had won, and World War II was over. So the conflict ended without Japan actually deploying these aircraft, but would they have changed anything? Well, no. The Komet's proof of that enough. They shot down barely any aircraft, less than 20 tops, and that's even if we include unverified kills. And they lost 10 of them in combat. That's not including the ones they lost during testing. Basically, the Komet did nothing for the German war effort, and I assure you, they wouldn't have done anything for Japan either. The point defense idea just didn't really work that well. They could only fly for so long. Even if they were defending a certain point, they could only defend that one point for 7 minutes. And the Allies would send squadrons of bombers, many bombers, out to bomb particular points. There weren't enough comets, nor would there have been enough of the Japanese equivalents to actually do anything about all these bombers, and that's assuming even if they had a perfect run and didn't get shot down themselves. And they would have, because if they were hit at all, even though they were very fast and hard to hit, but if they were hit, they would almost immediately explode. So, yeah, there's a reason we don't generally use rocket-powered planes in modern militaries, though in true Imperial Japan fashion, they did briefly consider using these aircraft in ramming attacks against B-29s. They wanted their pilots to slam these aircraft into the enemy. Now, it's Imperial Japan. They were already doing that with their other aircraft, so I'm not exactly surprised, but also, these aircraft in particular were a lot more expensive than the other prop planes that they were using for their kamikaze attacks. Many of those planes were obsolete, which was part of the justification for using them as basically guided bombs. But these aren't like that. I mean, I'm sure if you did hit an enemy plane with one, it would do a significant amount of damage. But you're also wasting your own plane. And your pilot. The point is, it wasn't going to help. But they are still an interesting story, because a lot of people don't actually know that Japan even attempted this. And amazingly, there are still a few in preservation. 2 to be precise, but they aren't the ones that were initially taken by America at the end of the war. 2 aircraft were taken in November of 1945 from Yokosuka to the US for evaluation aboard USS Barnes. One of those is now exhibited at the Planes of Fame Museum in Chino, California. The other was at Naval Air Station Glenview until at least October 1946, but that one was scrapped. However, in the 1960s, a nearly complete one of these was actually discovered in a cave in Japan. It was badly damaged, but it was salvageable. It was kept on display at a Japanese Air Self-Defense Force base near Gifu until 1999, when it was fully restored and completed by Mitsubishi themselves for display in the company's internal Kamaki Plant Museum. And it's still there now, as far as my research seems to show, so yeah. As perplexing as it is that they even attempted this, and as completely ineffectual as they wound up being since they didn't even get into proper service, or combat at all, it's still neat that Japan at least tried to copy one of Germany's least effective weapons in order to change the outcome of the war. Go figure. And with that, a special thank yous to all my underwater train finders, Some Dude 267, Orange Glass, Benjamin Nowens, Panzer Kitchen 131-232, Josh Johnson, Metal for Life Guy, Anzac A1, Arthur Roy, Tommy Rossini, Lord Captain Von Thrust III, Joshua Long, Brian, Jack Carson's Rora Videos, Hayden DeGrow, Master of None, Lord Hawk 444, The Baxter, That Guy with a Beard, Mark Holding, Lock Kraken, Murder Drone Stall, A Person 723, DM Trouble Typhoon, Hendrick Motorsports Fan 5, Alfonso Lapuche, Royal Hudson 2860, iSurfer 1405, Charles Kwiatkowski, Matthew Wolf, Dr. Racer 78, Ohio Trucker 1, Mr. Sleepy, Matt Weaver, Alaric Jaspers, Tom Red Lion, and NS Productions 8104. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.